What if three ordinary boys from three small Italian towns held inside them something the world had never quite heard before, and had no idea? What if the moment they first opened their mouths together, every person in the room understood, before a single conscious thought had formed, that something irreversible had just happened? Piero Barone, Ignazio Boschetto, Gianluca Ginoble. 15 years ago, they were teenagers. Today they are a phenomenon that has stopped entire stadiums cold, moved critics who swore they were unmovable, and reached into the lives of millions of people across every continent on Earth. This is not a greatest hits countdown. This is the story of how three voices became one, and how that one voice changed everything. The night everything started, it was 2009. Italy's beloved television program Il Lascio, una canzone had seen hundreds of young performers cycle through its stage. Gifted children, ambitious parents, polished little performances that were forgotten by the following week. Nobody expected anything different. The evening Piero, Ignazio, and Gianluca stood side by side under those studio lights for the first time. They were 13, 14, 15 years old. Piero's family had driven from Agrigento in Sicily. Ignazio had grown up surrounded by the warmth of Bologna. Gianluca carried within him the rolling hills of Roseto degli Abruzzi. Three different worlds. Three different voices. And then, a single opening note, the studio audience stilled. Not the polite attentiveness of people watching children perform. Something else. Something deeper and stranger. People stopped mid-conversation. A woman near the front of the audience reached for the hand of the stranger seated beside her without realizing she had done it. The judges sat forward. And the silence, that suspended, almost frightened silence, lasted a full 3 seconds after the final note before the eruption began. Oh, you could feel it even through a television screen, years later, watching archival footage. Il Volo was not discovered that night. It was recognized. But recognition was only the beginning. What came next would test everything. A performance that shook a nation. February 2015. The Sanremo Music Festival, 70 years old, fiercely beloved, deeply Italian, and for many the ultimate proving ground for any artist who dares to call themselves serious. Il Volo had spent 5 years building their career across the world, tours in the Americas, collaborations with legendary orchestras, recordings that bridged opera and popular song in ways that most people had assumed were simply incompatible, but this night was different. They walked onto the Sanremo stage and performed Grande Amore with a certainty and a stillness that seemed to belong to artists 3 times their age. The song built slowly, unhurriedly. Gianluca's baritone laying the foundation, warm and dark as Italian earth, Ignazio's tenor rising through the center, luminous and open, Piero's voice arriving at the summit like a clarion, filling every cubic inch of that storied theater. Italy watched on television in the tens of millions. Social media, which had not existed when Il Volo first sang together, erupted. Critics who had spent years writing skeptically about classical crossover were confronted with something they could not easily dismiss. When the votes were counted, Il Volo had won Sanremo by a margin that provoked genuine national conversation. Not just about music. About what music could still do to people, if the right voices delivered it. They did not just win a contest. They reminded Italy what its own voice sounded like. And yet, away from the spotlights, the price of all of this was something no one was speaking about. The untold weight of the extraordinary here is the truth that the golden light of sold-out arenas never quite captures. To come of age on a world stage is to trade the ordinary scaffolding of adolescence, the slow, stumbling, private business of becoming yourself, for something that is simultaneously magnificent and merciless. While their school friends were navigating the small dramas of teenage life, Piero, Ignazio, and Gianluca were on tour buses crossing time zones, giving interviews in 3 languages before breakfast, standing in front of crowds of 40,000 people on nights when their voices felt fragile and their bodies were exhausted, and no one in the arena could know any of that because the show had to begin. Those who have followed Il Volo closely over the years speak carefully about the rare, unguarded moments that surfaced, a particular tiredness visible behind a smile in a late-night interview, the brief flicker of something raw in Gianluca's expression after a technically demanding performance, the way all three of them would sometimes gather in a quiet corner backstage, not speaking, just present with one another, as if the simple fact of proximity was itself a form of restoration. The world was given Il Volo soaring. What the world did not always see was the daily, unglamorous, profoundly human work of keeping each other in the air. Which makes what happened next, what they chose to do, again and again, all the more extraordinary. The fans who became family, there is a particular quality to the bond that Il Volo has formed with their audience that is genuinely difficult to explain to someone who has not experienced it firsthand. It is not the ordinary transaction of performer and admirer. It is something closer to recognition, the same word that describes what happened in that studio in 2009. Fans have shared stories of attending Il Volo concerts that feel less like entertainment and more like events around which their lives divided into before and after. A retired schoolteacher in Buenos Aires who had not wept since her husband's funeral found herself unable to stand during the final encore, not from grief but from something she could only describe as the sudden, unexpected return of beauty to a life from which beauty had quietly slipped away. A father in Madrid who brought his 17-year-old daughter to a concert intending to share something he loved, watching instead as she gripped his arm during Nessun Dorma and whispered, without any self-consciousness, that she finally understood, these are not isolated accounts. They are the texture of Il Volo's impact across 15 years and dozens of countries. Young people discovering classical music as something alive and urgent rather than distant and dutiful. Older listeners finding that a voice they first heard decades ago in an opera house was now reaching them again through three Italian men who had grown up alongside YouTube. The music crossing every border human beings have erected, of age, of language, of geography, of taste, and arriving, intact and devastating, on the other side. They do not perform for audiences. They sing to people. And people feel the difference immediately. But perhaps nothing reveals the truth of Il Volo more completely than what happens when the cameras are gone. The Brotherhood behind the curtain ask anyone who has spent time around Il Volo off stage. A crew member, a journalist admitted backstage, a fellow musician, and the answer is consistent. What you see on stage is real. The warmth between Piero and Ignazio and Gianluca is not choreographed. It has not been managed by a record label or workshopped by a publicist. It is simply what 15 years of an extraordinary shared life produces. There is the particular humor that exists only between people who know each other too well to maintain pretense, Piero's sharp wit finding its target, Ignazio's broad, unguarded laugh, Gianluca's quieter amusement that surfaces when he thinks no one is watching. There are the rituals that form on long tours without anyone deciding to form them. The songs they sing to each other when no audience is present, simply because singing together is as natural to them as speaking. The arguments that are resolved not with diplomacy but with the directness of people who are too close to afford the fiction of formality, and there is something else. Something harder to name. During performances of particular emotional weight, a requiem, a love song, a piece that carries the accumulated grief of 100 years, the three of them find each other across the stage with a look that belongs entirely to themselves. You could spend a lifetime in music and not fully parse what passes between them in those moments. But you would recognize it, the way that studio audience recognized something in 2009 before they had language for what they were hearing. And then came the moment. The one that audiences will speak about for the rest of their lives. The night the world stood still, picture a piazza in Rome. The last golden light of an Italian summer evening spreading across thousands of upturned faces. The Colosseum visible in the middle distance, ancient and impassive, a witness to 20 centuries of human spectacle. The orchestra settles. The crowd, 40,000 strong, falls into a silence so complete you could hear a program drop that Il Volo walks to the front of the stage. What followed, in the accounts of those who were present, was not simply a performance. Gianluca's opening phrase of O Sol Mio arrived with a weight and a warmth that seemed to lower the temperature of the air. Ignazio's voice entered and the crowd, 40,000 people, made a sound that was not quite a gasp and not quite a sigh. And then Piero's tenor, high and blazing and somehow both effortless and devastating, opened above the other two voices like a door being thrown wide onto something enormous. People did not cheer. Not yet. Because the instinct, for a moment so large, is not to respond but to receive it. To stand very still and let it fill you completely before you trust yourself to move. An older man in the 43rd row, a retired professor of classical music who had spent 50 years attending performances across Europe, sat with tears running freely down his face and both hands pressed flat against his chest, as if he were trying to hold something inside himself that was threatening to come loose entirely. You could feel it, even watching a recording made on someone's phone, the colors washed out and the sound compressed. The moment was bigger than the medium carrying it. The moment was bigger than the piazza. 15 years of music, of sacrifice, of brotherhood, of 10,000 hours of practice and 10,000 hours on the road, all of it arriving, simultaneously, in a single phrase. A single held note. A single shared breath. The stones of Rome have heard everything. That night, they listened. Why any of this matters in an age when music is designed to be consumed in fragments. 30-second previews, algorithmic playlists, background noise for the perpetual motion of modern life. Il Volo makes a different demand. They ask you to stop. To be present. To feel something fully, without skipping ahead. This is, in the quietest possible way, a radical act. And it explains something that the streaming numbers and the ticket sales and the awards only partially capture. Il Volo's reach is not simply wide. It is deep. It reaches into people's lives and changes things that were not expecting to be changed. Young musicians who first heard Piero's voice at 14 and spent the next decade following it toward a life in classical music. Teachers who use Il Volo recordings to give students an entry point into an operatic tradition that had seemed impenetrable. Families for whom attending a single Il Volo concert became one of the defining shared memories of their lives together. The legacy of Il Volo is not located in any single recording or performance. It is distributed across 15 years of encounters between three extraordinary voices and the millions of human beings those voices have reached, in concert halls and living rooms and car journeys, through headphones on night trains and through television screens on Sunday evenings, in the dark and in the light and in all the ordinary hours of ordinary lives that were briefly made extraordinary by a sound. The flight continues 15 years. Think about what that means. 15 years of stepping onto stages in cities whose names their parents had only read in books. 15 years of voices that have deepened and matured and gathered new colors with every passing season, carrying within them now the full richness of everything they have lived. 15 years of choosing each other, in the arguments and the exhaustion and the grief and the joy and all the unspectacular daily work of sustaining something that matters. O Barone. Ignazio Boschetto. Gianluca Ginoble. They are no longer the boys who stood wide-eyed under studio lights in 2009. They are men who have seen the world and been seen by it, who carry their history in their voices and their brotherhood in their bones, who walk onto every stage knowing exactly the weight of what they are carrying and choosing to carry it anyway, every single night. And here is the final truth about Il Volo, the one that outlasts every award and every review and every standing ovation. The human voice, trained and honest and offered freely, is still the most powerful instrument on earth. It crosses borders that armies cannot. It finds people in their grief and their loneliness and their ordinary evenings and reminds them, without a single spoken word, that beauty is real, that connection is possible, and that there are still things in this world worth stopping 4.15 years. And the sky above them, still infinite. Still theirs. Keep watching. Keep listening. The best of Il Volo is still ahead.